In this episode, I'm talking with Dr. Margaret Moreton. Margaret is the principal of Lever Consulting and is passionate about all things community resilience. And today we're talking about community resilience. Do we understand it? And are we holding back? So a little bit about Margaret. Margaret is a consultant who works with government, NGOs, emergency service agencies, and communities themselves. The focus of her work is community resilience, how to recognise it, and how to strengthen and support it. She's developed a community conversation resource, Our Community, and has written an ebook, Building Resilience in the Face of Catastrophic Events, based on the voices of community members that have been affected by disasters. Now, I like to start a little bit with where we met. Now, I sat behind Margaret at a Mudri, which is the Monash University Disaster Resilience Initiative presentation, probably a few years ago, and I was instantly drawn to her passion and her experience when it comes to community resilience. She was the one asking all the really good questions. And our paths have crossed again regularly ever since. So, hi Margaret, welcome.
Hi Renae.
Now, the purpose of corporate to community is to build national resilience, and community resilience is absolutely part of the centre of this. So can you explain what is community resilience?
So the usual answer we give is that community resilience is about the ability of a community to withstand shocks and stresses arising from disasters and emergency events. So that's the stock standard kind of answer. I like to describe it as communities being able to help one another get back on their feet, work together and create a new life post whatever the event has been. I actually don't like the phrase a new normal, although people use it all the time. Most community members who talk to me say nothing's normal ever again. But they do, they help one another, they stand up, they help their businesses, they help their families, all the systems that exist within a community. It's about them getting back into a way of operating that's functional and satisfying.
And so why is community resilience so important?
Well, you see, you're talking to someone who's very biased. It's because communities are at the middle of everything. We live in communities, we're born into communities, we work in communities, we exercise and have recreation in communities. If not for community, then there's no purpose to anything, really. So I see communities at the centre of the entire process.
I have to absolutely agree with you there, Margaret. Now, how good are we as Australians at community resilience?
Well, the appropriate answer would be to say that we're pretty good at it. We have organisations and governments with programs and policies and frameworks. We have a strong understanding of it. We have a strong emergency services sector. We have organisations like the Disaster Resilience Institute. We have researchers. So that's the appropriate answer that I should give is that we're very good at it.
Okay, give me the real answer.
So the real answer is that I think we're not very good at it. I think we have a lot of resources. We're very fortunate to live in a country that is well-resourced, and I don't think we're using those resources the way we need to. My most frequent conversations are with people on the ground in communities affected by these events. Often I talk to them after something has occurred and they are devastated and they're frustrated because to live in a country with this much wealth and this much information and this much expertise and to still be living in a demountable home or a caravan 6 months after a massive event destroyed your home without running water, without a telephone, in a black spot, it's difficult. So on the one hand, I think that we are doing some things quite well, and on the other, I'm frustrated, and so are many in the community. We're not doing well.
Yeah, I think two things. You're kind of, to me, talking resilience almost in a way of recovery. So talking about how you work with a lot of communities after they have been through a event. And I find it interesting and quite wonderful, to be honest with you, because we hear there's a before, during and after a disaster. And I always think that the after is actually also the before, because in today's era of disasters, while you're recovering from the next, you're also obviously planning, you're recovering from the past, you're also planning for the next. Is that what you sort of see resilience as, is in terms of recovery, is also resilience?
Absolutely. Because events are becoming more and more frequent and more intense, and this previous summer is a perfect example of that. Such a large area devastated in multiple states, and so many events on top of one another. I was speaking to somebody in the Beaker Valley yesterday where I'm doing a project, and he was describing how in 6 weeks they had 4 separate fire attacks on their community and 2 floods.
Wow.
I mean, that's outrageous. And yet it's true. So I now talk about the entire process as being circular and cyclical, and rolling forward. So every preparation we do, there will likely be some event that has been part of our history that we have been recovering or are considered to have recovered from. And when people have a massive event like last summer, like Black Saturday, like the fires in Canberra, like the cyclones in far north Queensland, like the floods across most of Queensland some years ago, when people have these events, part of their recovery process, in my experience, is that they look at one another and say, we must be better prepared. If we had been better prepared, our recovery from this event would be easier for us. And so let's think about how to prepare for the future as part of recovery. Now, they may not initially think of it as part of their recovery, but by working together and preparing for the future, they're strengthening their bonds as a community. And this is part of the recovery process. So I don't see the phases anymore, as we all say they're not separate and they're not linear and they overlap. I was speaking with another group this morning saying, I think even that is now understating it. Under COVID circumstances, we have multiple disasters occurring simultaneously. We're no longer able to really separate preparation, response, relief, recovery. They are all happening simultaneously, depending on where you live and who you are. We really need to expand our thinking and kind of drop the models that help us understand. They're useful as models, but in the real world, that's about as limited as it gets. We need to think about them being simultaneous phases. Preparation, if we could just get everybody to do more preparation before or after a crisis, then the recovery and the resilience of these communities would be continually strengthened.
Oh, absolutely, 100%. I find it interesting too. A lot of the government agencies that are set up after the bushfires, etc., they're all called recovery agencies. And I had this. We had John Blackburn on as a podcast a couple of episodes ago, and he's very much focused on we need to drive a new language because it is about preparedness and resilience. And I think again, the language needs to change. When we're looking at community recovery, it's community recovery and resilience. Or
absolutely. And I often use recovery and resilience together. And I think the labels get in the way a bit. They're all part of one picture. And I agree. I wish the agencies that have been set up, certainly in both Victoria where I live and nationally around recovery, they should be resilience agencies. The purpose of the Australian federal government should be to create a resilient nation. That's what we should be doing. And there are so many different elements and so many different systems within that. It shouldn't just be about a small part of the puzzle. We must, develop resilience in order to recover from future fires, floods and cyclones. No, if the COVID-19 crisis has taught us anything, surely it's taught us the entire system in which we live is affected. We need to work to create a resilient nation, and preparing and responding and providing relief and recovering are all elements, but resilience has got to be the goal.
Margaret, it's like we've had this conversation many times before and you're reading my mind. Could not agree more. I mean, it's got to be led by leadership at the federal government and then across state governments, right down into local communities and also businesses. I think resilience has to be a strategic priority, and we need a people movement across all stakeholder groups to activate it. Absolutely. And it's as important at that federal leadership level as it is at that community level.
Yeah.
Now, can I ask you, who are the key players when it comes to building community resilience then in the communities? Who are the ones inside the community and who are the ones outside the community?
Yeah, so there are definitely sets of people involved. So it's really interesting. You know, I often say to people, if particularly if a crisis has occurred, if you're trying to work out who the influencers are in a community, then go along to the community meeting when we were allowed to do such things in person, and watch the room and particularly look at the back, because the person who's on the stage interviewing or introducing the guest and the person who's raising the hand and shouting and asking all of the questions, they're not the two people that I personally am interested in. I'm interested in the person who's leaning against the back wall and listening, and every now and again will nod and other people will begin to nod too. Or they might murmur something to someone beside them. They're not going to ask the question loudly. But that person, people are watching, because if George or Joyce or whoever it is, if they're on board, I'll be on board, because they're someone I've known or my family has known. It depends from community to community. So it's those quiet influences that people trust. It's such an interesting dynamic. You have to trust someone to follow them. So I think the people inside the communities are the salt of the earth, head of the fire brigade or the SES. They are the neighbourhood house manager. They're the person who comes and looks after or runs the tuck shop for the primary school. They are the person who runs the library. So it varies what role they have in a community, but every community will know who they are. If you sit and have coffee with people from community, people will say, oh, the people in our community that we look to for leadership are so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so. In my own community where I grew up, I didn't value it at the time. I so wish I could tell her now. The woman who ran the music club, she held that community together. She created resilience every single day. And now I realise that as an adult. I didn't as a kid. So that all sorts of people inside the community are champions of resilience. They might not even think of it in that way. There are people outside of a community that also build resilience. I remember my first study into this area, I went to 4 separate communities, and every single one of them, I didn't know they were going to do this, mentioned the Bendigo Bank. And so I gave that feedback back to the Bendigo Bank. So there'll be organisations, there'll be large organisations and large businesses that may well be supporting community resilience, either consciously or otherwise. There'll be small businesses supporting resilience by operating and providing ways for people to connect with one another. There are NGOs whose business it is to create community resilience. And of course, there's local council and governments at all levels. So there's a lot of stakeholders in play. And I guess I would just want to say that how that works and how that interaction happens will vary from place to place. So I think it's a really important message to say understanding resilience is a local issue. One must understand the local community to understand what creates resilience in that place. And of course, I'm talking physical communities. There are all sorts of communities.
And I think that's so true, because no community, it's like we say, no disaster is the same, but no community is the same either.
That's
now,
right.
Part of the topic of what we're talking about today is community resilience. Are we holding back? So how are we holding back, and who can change that?
This is such a challenging question. I definitely think we are holding resilience back. I think that people don't intend to. I have no expectation or understanding that people are intentionally holding community resilience back. I have a fear that I will probably offend many people by what I'm about to say. I think we hold communities back because we think as organisations. I've spent a long time working in government. I think we think in frameworks, we think in policies and procedures, we think in structures, we use a different language. And because we believe what we do works, we get more and more wedded to the way we work. It's been quite interesting for me to leave working in large bureaucratic organisations at the federal government level and to step off what felt like a cliff and work as an individual in communities on the ground. Now, I do work for governments, I do work for NGOs, I do work for local councils, and for other organisations in this field. But I think one of the things I think I offer is that I understand how those organisations work because I've worked in them. But I also understand how communities work. I grew up in one. We all belong to a community. I particularly draw on the community I grew up in, which was in the country, in a rural community. And they speak a completely different language. It always entertains me when I go to that community. They think I'm from a foreign land, particularly when I worked in government, because the language I would use was just unfathomable. And when I talk to community members now, the language people use when they go out to help in recovery centres is often unfathomable. Now, it's really hard to hear that message when you're in an organisation whose entire purpose is to help community resilience. I think we somehow have to be brave enough to ask ourselves, are we getting this wrong? So many community members tell me if only people would just get out of the way, give us what we need, and we'll do it.
I think the language is a big problem, and it's the same with businesses and communities and government. It's like we all speak completely different languages and look at, we're all looking at things from a different, I guess, piece of the pie. But at the end of the day, it's one pie that we all need to participate in and contribute to. So we've got to find some common ground and also common language so that we can all identify the roles and responsibilities and how we can each contribute. And you can't do that when you don't even understand, who's saying what.
The language. And that's right. Language has to be the first point. And then from that different language and that different perspective, we develop completely different processes. And I remember when I was in government, accountability was a very key issue, managing risk and managing accountability chains. And so the reasons for all the forms and the paperwork is in order to demonstrate very clearly when questioned, usually with headlights, where did you spend this money and why, and do you have an evidence trail? And so government often approaches community resilience or community recovery from that accountability frame, when actually that's a slower, multi-stepped process, which is not great from a community member's point of view.
My experience of that and how I like to summarise it is I think that a lot of what comes out of government and businesses sometimes to an extent are outputs. So they have the number of things they want to do or the amount of cash they're giving out or the number of grants they're giving out, but it's not actually feeding necessarily to outcomes. So it's not actually delivering or providing the end result that's required. And I think a great example is in East Gippsland, we've been talking to a number of small businesses who've had up to 17 touch points from various government agencies and relief agencies. And some grants have 2 places you can apply for them that are not even connected, yet they're not actually getting the help they need. And I think that's a big problem, that it has to be flipped. The focus has to be flipped to go, what do these communities need? And then how can we deliver that and support them, not make the assumptions of what community recovery and resilience is, or copy what's been done in the past. Because we know if we plan for future disasters based on the past, then we're all in big trouble.
And the number of communities that know what they need, that absolutely know what they need to enhance their resilience pre-event, to prepare for a possible event, to recover after event, they actually know what to do. And they have to spend all their time and energy trying to find the right grant that will help them do that. And then they have to try and work out how to shoehorn what they want to do because they know it will work for them because they understand their community better than anybody else. And they're trying to shoehorn their great idea to meet the requirements of a grant program, and it doesn't quite, and so they don't apply it. Good heavens, if we just had more flexibility, more integration, communities know what will enhance their resilience.
But I think that's correct. I think, a lot of the grant programs and a lot of the, programs and funding that come out of siloed focused departments or agencies or organizations that have, I'm not going to say a self-interest, but let's be honest, they do. They're by people who have jobs who have to, meet their output and KPI requirements to keep their jobs. So I guess the needs of communities for that recovery and resilience is almost forgotten, or it's almost a last minute kind of add-on. It's like, well, this is what I need to deliver, so that's what you're going to get. Which again, if we just flipped it around, I think the outcome would be so much more.
Yeah, agreed.
Now, changing tune a little bit. So yourself, Chris Quinn, and myself were on a webinar recently for the Business Continuity Institute, and we talked about unified resilience. But where does community resilience sit alongside organisational and infrastructure resilience?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think there's also, individual resilience, and there's a whole sector of work on resilience in children and young people and how we build resilience individually. I think they all sit in a sort of an interlinked, I don't know what sort of shape to suggest, but anyway, they're all interlinked and they're all important. If we don't have resilient organisations, then we're not going to deliver resilient infrastructure. If we don't have resilient infrastructure, we're not going to have resilient communities. If we don't, it could just go on and on. So we have this lots of elements of a resilience way of looking at the world or a resilience frame, and they're all really important. And I love that we did that conversation together, because usually it's more competitive than that. Even if that competition is implied, a bit like the programs, everything's divided and funded separately. Where in fact it's all interlinked. I'm working with a council at the moment, and they were the meeting I had earlier this morning. And, the resilience inside their organisation, their employees coping with COVID-19, is absolutely integrally related with how they communicate with their stakeholders, with their community members, with the businesses. And so they're trying to manage all of that. It's all interlinked.
Yeah, 100% agree. And that's why, it needs to move, as well as the language changing, it needs to move from the siloed tactical focus to a holistic strategic approach, because again, resilience is resilience, and we are all Australians and we all need to contribute, and we need to be thinking differently and doing differently, dare I say, when it comes to disasters. Now,
this is a pretty big challenge. Just before you move on, Renae, it's a very big challenge, because in our Western, dare I say, frame of thinking, the individual has been paramount. And I'm hoping that we can move toward a more collective understanding, a more holistic understanding, because if we saw what we do as connected to everything else, if we saw all of these individual systems as connected, then we'd think about the consequences of action in one part of the system on another part of the system. And if the individuals who are getting tested for COVID-19 and then going shopping saw themselves as part of, or going to the pub, saw themselves as part of a whole, then it might help them to consider the consequences for the collective. But it's a very different way of thinking to what we're used to doing in Australia or in many Western countries. Anyway, that gets into philosophy, which we probably shouldn't do.
That's all right, though. Well, we've got the solutions, though, so we're just driving it. We've just got to bring people along with us. Now, I was part of the working group, kindly invited to contribute to and comment on a handbook that you've been writing for the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience. It's the Community Engagement Handbook, and anyone listening, strongly urge you to log on to the AIDA website and have a look at their handbook. handbooks. So this new community engagement handbook, who's it for and what does it say?
That's so interesting. Who it's for was quite a discussion. It kept coming up through the development of the handbook. Initially, we tried to make the handbook something that could be accessible and therefore be written for anybody, be it someone from business, someone from the community, someone from local council or any level of government, someone in an NGO, anyone. And to some degree, we stuck with that, and we have tried to be inclusive in the development of the handbook. However, because of the conversation we were having earlier about language, and for other reasons, it was quite challenging to do that. I think the reality is that people in the emergency management and the local council areas, those two groups will be possibly the most frequent reader of the handbook or accessor of the handbook. Some NGOs will look at the handbook. It would be fantastic if more people access the handbook. I suspect, though, those are the groups that we ended up shaping it for. We were also trying to decide how to pitch it, whether to pitch it for people who had very little experience in engaging with communities around emergencies and disaster resilience, or whether to pitch it at people with extensive experience. In the end, we've probably gone more toward the new to some experience. We decided that it would be tricky to go too sophisticated and have someone pick it up and be completely lost. So it was quite a balance trying to work out that question.
Yeah, it was a great, robust discussion, which obviously I had to put my 5 cents in of including businesses as a stakeholder group as well, which they have been included, which is fantastic. And for people from businesses and the corporate world in particular, if you're wanting just to get a bit of an overview and a bit of an update on community engagement in the space, the handbook is a great read because it gives you a really good oversight and lots of great links that will help you.
And it's really important that business is involved. Business is such a valuable part of developing resilience, maintaining resilience, and helping with recovery if an emergency does occur. Business must be at the table at all levels.
Yeah, agree. And I think for me, Margaret, and we've had this conversation before, I almost say small businesses are your communities as well, because more often than not, and you mentioned it before, you know, the owner of the local general store is probably the captain of the CFA. So they're a leader in their local businesses, and they're they serve the community, and they're a leader in their community groups as well. And I think COVID has probably put small businesses on the table, but they're a stakeholder group that has been forgotten for so long, and it's now time that they really are considered and recognised as the value that they have, and do have a seat at the table, because I think there's a few seats that could probably swap some chairs, dare I say.
I agree. And I really think small business is such a crucial part of local communities. So we must do everything we can to keep them going.
Correct. Now, I always ask the same final question. So not restricted to your focus area or what you do, but what would be the 2 things you'd like to be done differently in the disaster space?
2 is unbelievably inadequate. I was thinking about that and thought, good heavens, 2 things. There's so much I would like to see change. So I think the first thing I would say is moving toward a more holistic look at the situation, which we've touched on a couple of times in our conversation. I would really like sectors and jurisdictions. So I would like states and territories. I'd like a national way of coordinating and bringing together jurisdictions and the sectors of education, transport, land planning. We're starting this conversation, emergency management, community development. All of these different areas need to be somehow connected so that we coordinate and share information. The number of projects that I'm currently doing for one organisation in one of those sectors, and the project result would add value if it was publicly available. I keep referring people in one state to another state's website because there's some small business recovery material there, and someone needs to take a much more coordinated look at what's available. We're reinventing the wheel over and over and over in different levels, in different jurisdictions, and it's very inefficient. So I would love to see something that brought a holistic perspective to all of the information that's available.
Well, Margaret, if I can interrupt you slightly, that would be called the Resilient Australia Alliance, which might be launching a bit later this year. So stay tuned. And
Excellent.
sorry, and your second.
My second would be, we're not looking at each other, so you can't see my lovely grey hair. I've been around a fair while, and when I first joined the Commonwealth Public Service back in the 80s, there was an entire department that was focused on communities at a federal level.
Wow,
and
really?
they were focused on focused on developing and enhancing. They didn't use resilience at the time as the term, but it was the Department of Communities. I think we need to think about how much money we could save, if that's your, bailiwick, how much good we could do, how many outcomes we could achieve if we enhanced communities. If there was a way of focusing on developing community leaders, supporting community leaders. My vision is to have a network of people across communities all across Australia, not just in relation to having led and worked in recovery after a disaster, but in relation to sharing educational approaches. There are small business. There are so many areas of our normal kind of daily life that we could enhance if we took the step to invest in communities. I mean, we have a great example at the moment where Steve Pascoe's over in previously led recovery or was part of recovery. He'll be telling me off for naming him.
No, I've just confirmed him from an upcoming episode. So he'll be
he's such a good man.
Very soon. He's awesome. He's so wonderful. He's great.
I recommend the listeners pay attention and listen to Steve's then, because Steve is an example of community leadership, and he's now working in Malakuta, where a section of that community is frustrated, and he's helping them work out how to drive their own recovery processes. Now, we need to be connecting strong, trustworthy, capable community leaders all over this nation, and then we need to be looking at our youth and developing them. So I would focus on community leadership outside of our sphere of emergencies in general, and ask the question of why are we not having an integrated approach to enhancing communities?
Yeah, it's a great question and a great strategic approach. And I guess the question is, who is the leader who leads it? That's what I find. It's like the answers are kind of simple. It's just like who owns it and who drives it. And I guess, from my perspective, and I mentioned the Resilient Australia Alliance before, and it's exactly that gap. It's like we're all Australians. We all want to have a great future living in this wonderful country that we're in. So what little bit can we do? But we need someone to lead that way. I love the Department of Communities. I know I've connected a lot with Tammy and the crew in Queensland at their Department of Communities. I think it's a fantastic language to use. It sets exactly what it is, and I absolutely let's lobby and make that happen again up in Canberra. Yeah. Margaret, thank you so much. It's always so nice to chat with you. We could literally go on and on and on as we normally do. So a big thank you to Dr. Margaret Moreton. She's the principal of Lever Consulting, and her contact details will be on the podcast website if you want to connect with her. Today we've been talking about community resilience. Do we understand it, and are we holding back? I think we know the answer to that one now. We absolutely are. And given the COVID and the bushfires and the drought, not to mention the future disasters ahead, I don't think there's a more important time to put community resilience at the forefront of everything we do, and resilience to be the word that describes what needs to happen, which integrates recovery, it integrates preparedness, and it integrates response. So thanks so much, Margaret. No doubt I'll be talking to you very soon.
Thank you very much, Renae.